Hey everybody, let everybody connect. Hey everyone, yay, thank you for being here. Awesome. We're just gonna give it like 1 or 2 more minutes, let people in. If everyone can mute, other than Ella and Maya, or you can mute too if you guys want, but whatever you wanna do. We'll just give it like a minute or so and let some people hop on. Thanks for being here, everyone. It is Earth Day, a day that we really like at WIC. So we're happy to have Ella and Maya here. We'll get started in a sec. Getting a sneak preview of our presentation here. Ella, you're muted too. I can tell you're trying to talk. Okay, you're good. Right. I guess we'll get started. I think we should get. Oh wait, no, Ella, you good?
Of course, in the last moment, my finger slipped and I could not get backwards on the presentation. So give me 3 minutes.
You're good. We'll let you set back up. In the meantime, how's everyone's Earth Day? You can send it in the chat if you're having a particularly good Earth Day. I'm having a good one. All good from that. Ellen Jacob, it's going great. That's awesome. Very good from Nolan. That's also awesome. Oh, we got another person here. Awesome. Got a few more people joining us, so we'll wait a sec. Awesome. Okay. Ella and Maya, how you guys doing? You think you want to start? All good? Yay, we got thumbs up. Okay, we'll get started. I'll probably, if I stop abruptly, it's me letting people in from the waiting room. But hello, everybody. Happy Earth Day. We are super excited to have Ella and Maya here today. My name is Annabelle. I'm the ED at WIC. This is our first ever WICCourse event. This is part of like a larger series of events that mainly are just to start a larger discourse around water insecurity in the US. And like I said, we are very excited to have Ella and Maya here to talk about this. They did some research that they're going to tell you about in Hoosick Falls in 2017. Just a little bit of background on why we're focusing on Hoosick Falls. I personally live in Greenwich, New York, which is, I think, around 45 minutes away from Hoosick Falls. So it's an upstate New York town. Since 2014, they've been enduring this water crisis that was caused by PFOAs in the water by Saint-Gobain and Honeywell International, which is a plastic manufacturing plant. So there's a lot of issues and discourse surrounding that we're going to talk about today. We'll be hearing from Ella, Sampou, and Maya Cohn. I'm going to pass it off to you guys to introduce yourselves, and then they're going to hop into their awesome presentation. So take it away, guys.
All right, good evening, everyone. As Annabelle said, happy Earth Day. My name is Ella Sampou, and I am a community organizer and activist.
My name is Maya Cohn. I work on Capitol Hill doing environmental, energy, and agriculture policy work.
Before we jump into what happened in Hoosick Falls, we want to give a shout out to the third member of our capstone group, Annika Verma, who is not presenting with us tonight because she is in law school, but obviously we could not have done this without her. And she is an upstate New York local, and she introduced us initially to the topic. So thanks, Annika. We're going to go over a little bit of Hoosick history and a little bit of legislative history to demonstrate how the crisis in Hoosick Falls came to be, and then we're going to get into our research, which we titled Invisible and Insidious, a Study of Water Contamination in Hoosick Falls. Hoosick Falls is a very small village nestled in the foothills of eastern upstate New York with a population currently of less than 3,500 people. It has a lengthy history as a hotspot for manufacturing and production, which dates back as far as the 1890s. And for the first half of the 20th century, Hoosick Falls experienced a very large economic boom, hosting multiple factories and plants that were operating simultaneously. In the 1940s, we have a substance introduced to the market called PFOA. It's a new type of plastic, and shortly after its invention in 1956, a plant opens on McCaffrey Street in Hoosick Falls that manufactures it. We all likely know PFOA as Teflon. It's a non-stick plastic, and it's used in everything from cookware to the brake pads in your car to the flame retardant in your couch. It's part of a larger family of poly and perfluoroalkyl substances. But the thing you need to know about PFOA is that its defining characteristic is that it does not degrade in nature. It literally does not break down, earning it the title of forever chemical. This plant changes hands several times and is finally purchased by its current owner in 1999, Saint-Gobain. While this manufacturing and this changing of hands is going on over the course of a century, we have several key pieces of legislation that are introduced in the 1970s. We have the Safe Drinking Water Act, which delegates the responsibility of keeping drinking water clean and safe to the EPA, and it regulates a wide range of factors, treatment techniques, taste and color of water, but most importantly, it regulates the acceptable levels of contaminants in public water systems. And the EPA uses 3 criteria to decide if some sort of contaminant needs to be regulated. Firstly, the contaminant needs to be known that the chemical or compound may or may likely have an adverse effect on human health. The contaminant also needs to be suspected to be in high concentrations in public water supplies. And then finally, if the administrator of the EPA thinks it would benefit public health to regulate that contaminant, they may do so. This legislation regulates about 90 contaminants, but I think it's important to note that on the market, currently there are about 80,000 substances in production. I also want to make note of the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule called the UCMR, which is an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act that was first introduced in the 90s and has been updated several times. But basically, the UCMR provides guidelines on how the EPA should keep an eye on these unregulated contaminants in drinking water. Unfortunately, in the 90s, municipalities with less than 10,000 people don't qualify for this type of monitoring. And again, Hoosick Falls, for most of its history, has a population of less than 4,000 people. Shortly after we get the Safe Drinking Water Act, we get the Toxic Substances Control Act, which regulates new chemicals before they enter the market and regulates chemicals that existed before 1976 that are known to pose an excessive risk to the environment. So by known to pose a risk, we're talking about things like lead and mercury, which humans have been producing and using in manufacturing for quite some time. At this point in human development, we're all aware that lead and mercury are quite poisonous. So TSCA regulates these obvious toxins and anything going forward. Additionally, it regulates the distribution of these chemicals. 62,000 chemicals are grandfathered into this act, 62,000 that were created before 1976, which means that it's assumed that these substances are not a threat to public health. How does the EPA know if a material has a threat to public health? It's up to manufacturers to provide retrospective information about health effects to the EPA, but the system by which the EPA can require testing is not very robust, and it can be a legal and bureaucratic nightmare for the EPA to get that information from manufacturers in the first place. The EPA then only has 90 days after the receipt of this information to take action. So only about 40% of acute toxicity testing is ever completed with this information. So just kind of to recap here, we're a little bit past mid-century and there are standards in place, but there are some loopholes. Chemicals are only regulated after they're known to cause harm. Many chemical compounds have been assumed safe by default, and it's up to manufacturers to submit safety data to the EPA. Circling back to Hoosick Falls, where nonstick plastics are being manufactured for a full 2 decades before any drinking water protections are in place. In 1999, the plant gets sold for the last time to Saint-Gobain. In 2003, Saint-Gobain stops manufacturing PFOA in the United States. And in 2006, a whopping 60 years after PFOA has been on the market, the EPA finds that it is possibly carcinogenic. Meanwhile, the people of Hoosick Falls have begun to suspect that there's something in the tap water that makes them sick. There's kind of this like local lore that residents have unusually short lifespans and that they're plagued by rare diseases and cancers. In August of 2014, after the untimely death of his father, local resident Mike Hickey, among others, asks the then mayor to test the water. And the village turns to the State Department of Health. The Department of Health says, no, we will not sample the water. This municipality is excluded under the UCMR. And the residents have their water tested anyways, and individuals find in their wells that there are upwards of 540 parts per trillion PFOA in the water. At this time, the EPA maximum exposure is 400 parts per trillion. So just in people's wells, there's 140 parts per trillion too many, right? In January of 2014, residents put pressure on both the village government and Saint-Gobain to retest the water. And then it is found that there are upwards of 180,000 parts per trillion in drinking water. To do some quick math, that is 45 times the recommended short-term exposure. There is a contentious back and forth between the village, the State Department of Health, the state EPA, and Governor Cuomo about how to best address this problem. And finally, in 2016, the state EPA informs residents that their water is no longer safe to drink. In May of 2016, the EPA lowers its PFOA exposure advisory in drinking water to 70 parts per trillion, down from 400. And in the fall, the McCaffrey Street plant is listed as a federal Superfund site. It is then that Maya, Annika, and I arrive on the scene to do our research.
All right. So yeah, fall 2017, Ella, Annika, and I are choosing our capstone topic, and we want to do something that's focused on, public health, policy, social justice through an environmental lens. So we learned about what's going on in Hoosick Falls. It seems like the perfect case study through which to explore those issues. And what we're really interested in here is figuring out if there are any community proposed solutions that could be applicable on a larger scale. Because, Ella talked a little bit about how there are so many of these loopholes. Water contamination is an incredibly prevalent issue in our country. There are so many communities, coast to coast that are struggling with not just PFOA contamination, but, lead, 100 other things. And so we were interested in things that might be able to scale up from Hoosick Falls, policies that might be able to scale up. So we get out into the community, we talk to people, we let those conversations guide some questions that we want to ask folks in our survey. So we spend a couple hours camped out in front of a grocery store, talking to folks, asking about who they think is accountable for the water contamination and what exactly they want from their government. Slide, Ella, please. Thank you. So here's one of our graphs from this survey. What you're looking at here is the level of satisfaction and dissatisfaction for a few different government officials and institutions. So the first thing you'll notice here probably is that the level of dissatisfaction is quite a bit higher than a lot of these satisfaction levels. Going in, I think that we all expected to see a really high level of dissatisfaction and, also blame towards Saint-Gobain. They did the polluting. They are legally liable for this contamination. But as you can see, that's not really true. They, in fact, have the highest level of satisfaction, which, mind you, still is not very high, but still interesting. And then we're also seeing really high levels of dissatisfaction with the town mayor, Governor Cuomo, New York governor, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Department of Health, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So these are all people and institutions that are in place to protect and serve their constituents, the residents of Hoosick Falls. And as Ella said, there was a 2-year waiting period between which there was knowledge that this was contaminated water and the residents were notified. So we're starting to understand this level of betrayal and distrust that people in the community felt. Like I said, the second question we asked was what policies people would be interested in that would benefit either the individual, the community, or state and federal level solutions. So this was on our survey, and as you can see, we're seeing high approval levels kind of across the board with all 10 of these policy proposals, which I'll just quickly read off. Free lifetime bottled water, financial compensation for declining property values, free lifetime biomonitoring, financial compensation for PFOA related health issues, the community level and new drinking water source, filtering existing water sources, and then state and federal solutions, more chemical regulation by the EPA, safe drinking water as a constitutional right, a state-funded Water Institute, which would basically go about coordinating water issues on the federal level, and then more funding for small community water testing. As Ella said, Hoosick Falls, small community, it's a loophole. So what we kind of extrapolated from this data, seeing these very high levels of interest in policy proposals across the board, Hoosick Falls residents didn't really know what they wanted at this point. They didn't have one policy in mind that they thought, this will solve our problem and this will prevent this issue in the future. There was almost a sense that folks are grasping at straws here, trying to find something that might resolve, excuse me, the harm that has already been caused.
To talk a little bit about the state on the ground in Hoosick Falls right now, new information about PFOA exposure and the effects on human health are constantly coming to light. Recently, there was a revelation about what various actors at Saint-Gobain knew or didn't know about toxicity and knew or didn't know about pollution in the community. So there's certainly continued fuel for fire in Hoosick Falls. There were some local influentials, as we called them, who were our guides in 2016 and 2017 while we were there, who continue to vocally criticize the EPA and the state government. We have current mayor, Rob Allen, who campaigned on transparency. He was reelected successfully. This transparency is working. And also Laureen Hackett, who runs a Twitter page called PFOA Project New York 1. I recommend everyone check it out for updates, both about Hoosick Falls, but also about the national PFOA crisis that we're facing. Both of them continue to this day to be very, very active. in their community work. Residents continue to share information as it breaks, and the community still continues to regularly engage with government representatives and representatives from Saint-Gobain as they negotiate the path forward. But also, life has moved on. We're not seeing these small activist local Facebook pages being used the way we initially were. And there's tension in the village. There's an ongoing downtown revitalization effort, as well as a sewer improvement project. This village still has to allocate government funding to other going on projects despite not having drinkable water, and some residents are loudly frustrated by this. Additionally, the sewer improvement project revealed the existence of previously unknown volatile organic compounds, another type of contaminant. And so the struggle continues. When we left with the sense that this was only the tip of an iceberg of problems in this community. And I believe that continues to play out today.
So also locally, there's the cleanup effort for PFOA, which Saint-Gobain is legally required to do through Superfund law. So in 2016, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation enters into a consent order with Saint-Gobain, as well as the previous owners, Honeywell, that requires them to perform a remedial investigation and a feasibility study. So as of now, they've collected samples from soil, groundwater, and surface water. They've installed a couple different types of filtration systems. And that's it. This is 5 years later, and that is the level of progress that they've made in fixing this problem. In August 2019, they constructed a groundwater interceptor trench at the McCaffrey Street facility to collect, extract, and treat contaminated groundwater before leaving the property. And this feasibility study into permanent alternate water supplies is continuing. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The comment period for this was up in 2019. Only 40 people commented on it. And most of those comments were supporting no further action. So as you can see, the kind of issue attention cycle has moved past PFOA contamination in Hoosick Falls. This is no longer getting the kind of spotlight that it once did. So the DEC study that I mentioned, it identified and evaluated 5 different options for drinking water sources. Run through them very quickly. The first is new groundwater source. The second is a new surface water source. The third is an interconnection with an existing water supply. Fourth is a continued use of the current supply with a GAC filter, a granulated active carbon, I believe, filter, which is what's currently going on. And it is filtering at non-detect, so that's important. And it's filtering at non-detect for PFOA. That's important. And then the 5th option is the same as 4, continued use with the GAC filtration, but additionally an interim remedial measure to capture and treat PFAS impacted water at the McCaffrey Street site. So that's where we're at in Hoosick Falls right now. They're in the process of deciding which of those is going to happen. So on the federal level, PFOA and the umbrella contaminant PFAS has gotten a lot of attention. Pretty much every senator in the Senate has a community in their district that is dealing with PFAS contamination. So there's a lot of attention here. In 2019, the Trump administration puts out the PFAS action plan. Here they identified some priority actions, such as proposing a national drinking water regulatory determination for PFOA and PFOS, starting the process of listing them under CERCLA, which is the Superfund law, determining recommendations for cleanup, which still don't exist, and finalizing draft toxicity assessments. It's important. We don't really know at what point PFOA becomes toxic to the human body. It's probably carcinogenic, but we don't have that information to tell us when. So gathering that information is critically important, but we're really still in the beginning stages here. That's 2019. EPA misses their self-assigned deadline to issue a plan to set an enforceable legal limit for PFOA and PFOS at the end of 2019. Then on January 19th, 2021, some of you guys might remember the very last day of the Trump administration, the EPA announces a suite of actions across the agency focused on implementing this plan. Still just kind of like repetitive, the same stuff in the plan. They're going to initiate the process to develop the regulation. They're fast tracking some regulatory determinations. But right now in the Biden administration, that's all in the process of being reviewed to make sure that it fits with President Biden's goals on water safety. So we are still very much in the beginning stages of regulating PFOA. The NDAA here, this is last little bit of legislation we'll talk about. The National Defense Authorization Act, it's a military and defense bill that gets passed each year. We have been able to make some progress in these bills, actually. As we said, PFAS chemicals, they're in everything, including firefighting foam. So unfortunately, contamination is extremely prevalent on military bases. So in the most recent NDAA bill, Congress was able to ban certain PFAS-infused products and also accelerate the end of that type of PFAS firefighting foams. But yeah, as I said, we have not made a lot of progress here.
Despite not having made a ton of progress, we would like to leave you all with some hopeful concepts. We revisited everything we learned with fresh eyes over the past couple weeks in preparation for giving this talk. And we want to emphasize that the scene has changed in the past couple years. PFOA, right, as we've both said, it's not just an issue in Hoosick Falls or in the Ohio River Valley. It is a problem that is popping up everywhere. And if it's not a problem in your community right now, it could be a problem in your community soon. But we have this, when you zoom out and you connect the dots, we have this really intense, rich network of grassroots groups and awareness and people who are fighting to push for changes. We kind of have this mindset that there's a choice between clean water or a thriving economy, and that's a false dichotomy. There's no real reason that we need to be sacrificing human health or environmental health in the name of profit. So that's a mindset that is finally starting to change in American culture. There's also this concept of the precautionary principle that was very much emphasized to Maya and I in our educations, that we don't have to legislate like this. We don't have to wait until something's a problem to create legislation. We can lead with precaution and say, okay, it's not safe until proven poisonous. It's potentially poisonous until proven safe. And I think there is becoming a greater awareness of that kind of thinking. It's certainly what we were taught and how we were introduced into the world. Also, finally, we're approaching this era of green transition with jobs and manufacturing and public policy. Maya, if you want to speak on that a little bit.
Sure. I think that, as Ella said, there's for a long time been this idea, do you want to have jobs or do you want to have a clean environment? And we're finally talking about the fact that you don't have to choose. This is happening as we're talking about divesting from fossil fuels and moving to a green energy economy. It's the same concept here. We're in a green transition. We can invest in jobs in the renewable energy economy and in clean manufacturing. It is not true that economies cannot be based on sorry, I'm like triple negativing here. Extractive industries are not the only industries that can give people jobs. So we're in that era of green transition away from that kind of exploitative logic and towards a future where hopefully this type of thing doesn't happen as often.
Yeah, okay.
All right, awesome. Thank you guys so much for that. There's a lot to unpack, so I do want to dive right into questions with you guys. And audience members, you are all welcome to ask questions at the end too. You can either throw them in the chat if you already have them, or once we get through these first discussion questions, you can just unmute and ask them too. There's also a raise hand function if you guys are familiar with Zoom. But okay, I want to jump right in. Very excited. So first, let's start with your survey. You guys talked to 144 residents. You go to this Tops grocery store and get to really get involved in the community. So tell me about what it was like to talk to residents directly during this crazy time, this water crisis, and just getting that face-to-face contact with community members.
Yeah, okay, so I want to start off by saying that it was amazing. Mike Hickey and Lorraine Hackett, again, who were two community influentials whose names are core to the story. They took us in, they showed us around, they introduced us to the right people, and we have the most gratitude to them for being so welcoming to us in their time, in this time of crisis. So we didn't just go to Tops and hang out on the weekends, handing out surveys and pestering locals. We attended town hall meetings. We attended meetings with representatives from St. Gobain. We met with Rob Allen, who became mayor. We really got looped into these different groups in the community. And it was humbling. It was very humbling to watch all of this unfold in real time. We also had fun. It was complicated, enjoying the company of these folks, but then also having to remain as impartial observers. There were interpersonal conflicts in this community, and so it was complicated. It was hard. It was hard. We did develop emotional attachments. My favorite evening after a town hall meeting, Lorraine took us to a locals only bar, and we ended up playing a game of darts with some people who spoke at the meeting and with a documentary crew who was filming at the time. So it was really special to be, so welcomed into that community.
Yeah, of course. Maya, do you want to jump in here, or I can move on too?
Yeah, I just agree with Ella completely. We owe a real debt of gratitude to especially Mike and Lorraine, but all the people there who just gave us so much information, were so generous with their time, and made us feel we were always excited to come back. We always went to our capstone meetings with our thesis advisor, blabbing about what Lorraine said this week, and all the other capstone groups at Skidmore were really jealous of us because I think we had the most fun.
There was definitely a story to tell, and people wanted to tell their story. I talking to strangers is my forte, certainly, and I would hand out a survey, and then 5 minutes later somebody would be telling me the story of their life in Hoosick Falls and their thoughts, and so it was intense and it was wonderful.
Yeah, I feel like that's the beauty of small, tight-knit communities, because I think Hoosick Falls is around a population of 3,000 for people that aren't totally familiar. So that's kind of what it's like to live in a town like that. So yeah, community loyalty that comes with living in a small town. You kind of hinted at this a little bit in your presentation, but in your specific research too, you talk about like the ride or die theory, how just like a majority of respondents like wouldn't move away from Hoosick Falls, even if it meant they would receive some sort of compensation, they would still stay. So also Erin Brockovich, the very famous lawyer, came to Hoosick Falls, and she wasn't necessarily met with not open arms, but you know, she wanted to do an individualized personal injury lawsuit, and people weren't necessarily on board with that because of this mentality that you guys talk about. So tell me a little bit about like the role of that community loyalty that you guys observed during your studies there.
Sure. So do want to make sure that we're not kind of painting as a monolith here, because there were definitely some people we spoke to who would have been happy to leave Hoosick Falls if that were an option financially. And you'll remember that question on our survey where we asked if people were interested in being paid damages, being paid for their properties. And I think a high percentage of people said, yeah, we'd be interested in that. Only 52% of our respondents reported that they wouldn't leave Hoosick Falls if given the option. So it's just barely over half, compared to 31% who said they would leave Hoosick Falls if it was an option. And also want to say we haven't been there in 4 years, so perhaps that's changed. The interesting correlation that we found was that actually the more people were worried about the health effects of PFOA, the less likely they were to want to leave Hoosick Falls. So, you know, why is that? Are people thinking, you know, the damage is already done, my health has already been affected? You know, what does it mean to be a part of the community of, you know, 3.5 thousand, like you said, Annabelle? There's this sense of community in Hoosick Falls that really is irreplaceable. So are people thinking, you know, the damage is done, I'm going to stay here in this community that I love and, you know, just enjoy the rest of my life, even if perhaps it has been cut short by this chemical. As for the Erin Brockovich of it all, it's interesting to mention, I'm not certain we did say this, but Saint-Gobain paid more taxes than anyone else in Hoosick Falls. It's also the biggest employer of residents. So there's this kind of idea that you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And, you know, this corporation gave people the American dream in a lot of respects. And it is the state's fault, the government's fault, that Saint-Gobain was able to pollute. Everything that they did legally. They were operating in compliance with all legislation on the books. So there was definitely kind of this idea that plays into what Ella and I were talking about at the end here. There was this kind of idea that they had to choose jobs over a healthy environment.
I want to add on that note, if anybody is interested in further reading about the relationship between employers, the state, and community loyalty, I have it in front of me. Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell explores the mentalities that exist in small towns in some of the most polluted states in the nation. It is the case study on why people continue to work for these companies, why people love this town, love the company that employed them, despite the fact that they're being slowly poisoned and their homes are being destroyed. So, reading recommendation for anybody who wants to do some homework.
Yeah, always ready to do more homework. We'll put a link to that book in like a follow-up email. And
Cool.
if anyone wants to do some extra reading after this, extra Earth Day reading, we'll do that. So here at WIC, we were actually like kind of founded in response to the Flint water crisis, which like weirdly enough was happening almost at the exact same time. And the timeline is very similar as well to the Hoosick Falls water crisis. You guys mentioned in your research, and it kind of got a lot of national news when it happened. The mothers of Flint and the mothers of Hoosick Falls kind of had this like joint meeting. I forget what year, but it was in the midst of both of these very horrific water crises. So like what kind of comparisons can you make between these two crises, these two communities? I know there's some similarities and some differences. Do you guys want to kind of expand on that? Yeah.
Yeah. So in America, race and class are very much intertwined, and a lot of the exploitation of people and degradation of communities that we see is at the hands of hierarchy. And so these groups are different in the sense that Flint is a community of color and Hoosick Falls is more working class, white rural Americans. These demographics deal with different problems, but that being said, the problems that they deal with happen because these groups are much lower in the societal economic hierarchy that we exist in. We're seeing vulnerable groups of people suffer because of water contamination, because our culture allows them to suffer. Flint was an issue of outdated infrastructure that didn't get updated because their leaders thought it was not worth it to upgrade, whereas Hoosick Falls was a manufacturing behemoth poisoning residents. But neither of these groups of people have the social capital to change the course of how this plays out. Both of these instances are textbook cases of environmental justice, the idea that environmental problems hit hardest the most vulnerable people. So again, there are different contexts that brought these crises to a head, and certainly different groups of people, but they both exist because of the same systemic problems. That's a short and vague answer that uses a lot of buzzwords, but it's also a big question. That's like the most succinct answer I feel I can give. Maya, if you have anything you want to add to that, please.
No, I think you got it just right.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I can see the connections there. I guess in response to the Flint water crisis and up until I think 2017, water bottles was seen as like, let's give water bottles to these communities because it's seen as like a source of clean water. We could go on about how we feel about water bottles. We just talked about this in our WIC podcast, the last episode too, the problems with water bottles. But so as we saw with one of your slides, one of the potential options was, would you accept free lifetime bottled water as an alternative to drinking the tap water in Hoosick Falls? And around 50% said that that's like something that they would want. So can you talk a little bit about like what that implies for like water crises on the whole? Like you'd rather drink bottled water forever for free than like eventually rely on your own tap water, even if it is safe in some capacity in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, we know that providing bottled water is a Band-Aid solution, especially when it's being provided by, aid groups or nonprofits. People need water, but the more difficult situation is making sure that the groundwater is free from contamination, which is something that the feasibility study is focused on right now. But it's also the trust issue, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So at the time when people said, when like more than 50% of our respondents said that they wanted lifetime bottled water, that is happening. That question, that answer comes at a time when the GAC filtration system is already filtering out PFOA to non-detect levels. So maybe two things are going on here. One, maybe people are just going through the responses saying, yeah, I've been wronged. I deserve all these things. Why shouldn't I get free bottled water for the rest of my life? But the second thing is that there's like a legitimate continued distrust, not only of the water, but of these institutions that allowed water contamination to happen and could very well let it happen again. I remember when we were doing this project, we went to like a educational panel where they talked about the science of PFOA. And they said, PFOA is a C8 chain. They make that illegal, they start creating C7 chains. Boom, that's the next issue. Then C6, C5. These issues aren't going to go away by just phasing out one contaminant, because in order to keep giving people nonstick pans, they're just going to phase in another. So I don't remember if you asked how we like get at that, but I don't know. And it's really bad. So Ella, do you want to say?
Yeah. I think to follow up on the nonstick pan, like the phasing in new, we don't need nonstick pans, you guys. The idea that like we need to be using these things is, again, it's like a false belief. You do not necessarily, for the most part, like we don't need many of these compounds we can survive without. We could just scrub our pans a little bit harder, use cast iron, it's natural nonstick. But that's beside the point. We're talking about bottled water. Especially for ailing residents. We saw in the homes that we visited these, gallons and gallons of water, and it's not easy for older folks. It's not easy for people who are dealing with debilitating chronic illness to go pick up gallons of water every single day. So it's simply inconvenient, but also right. We have this issue of trust in this community. The wound of being poisoned silently is so deep that it's reasonable that somebody would never trust their tap water ever again. As Maya said, like you filter out one compound, but who's to say there isn't another one lurking that you haven't yet detected? Also, to kind of speak to the level of distrust in this community in general, we were there during Trump's first campaign, and if we had more time to do research, we would have dug into this a little bit deeper. But initially, we were asking people how they were voting and why, and the county that Hoosick is in did go for Trump. And a lot of people spoke to the fact that he wasn't their ideal candidate, but they were no longer willing to deal with people from the establishment. And so they were picking an anti-establishment leader because the institutions, the powers that be, were letting them down. So I think in communities where these types of crises happen, there is already distrust and discontentment brewing. Situations like this don't happen in communities that are already well cared for.
But to hop back in on that, communities of color who are finding water contamination crises are not communities who are voting for Trump. So I think that is also an important thing to kind of put in perspective.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, Ella, did you have a, oh, okay, sorry, I just didn't want to cut you off. Yeah, I think distrust is probably the biggest takeaway we can have from this. It's just like, we say that there's like Flints all across America. There's also Hoosick Falls all across America. And I think I'm glad you guys like came here today, like talk about it, because it's so indicative of the rest of, oh, sorry, I just saw a hand raised. Yeah, we'll pass it off to questions in a sec. Ellen, Jacob, if you guys have a question, feel free to hop in, go for it. You can unmute if you want.
Yeah, this is a little bit not as related to the social thing that you guys mostly did your study on, but both Ellie and I and two other students are students at Skidmore right now, and we are doing our capstone on the persistence of PFOA from ski wax on ski hills. And we we were wondering about how, in what you guys have been studied, how they use the granular activated carbon to filter the water, because we've been starting to go through those processes ourselves with trying to concentrate the PFOA from our samples. But we weren't sure what methods were used from the places you guys studied. If you don't know them, that's completely fine. I know it could be very specific, but we were just curious about that.
Are you guys environmental science? So we were environmental studies, but
yeah.
there's the GAC systems, and then there's also the POET systems, which work on point of entry. So those are useful because in Hoosick Falls, a lot of folks had wells. So would definitely recommend looking into that. Ella, you know more about well water and communities that use well water than I do, but
Yeah, I can't say I know much about the mechanisms of these filters. I was a studies major for a reason. But right, as Maya said, there's the POET and there's the GAC. And
there's a lot of good research out there that we cannot give you.
Speak to, but it's super exciting to have you guys in the audience. And it's awesome to hear that you guys are focusing on PFOA. Cool.
Carrying the PFOA candle. Woo!
I was gonna say that's awesome that you guys are continuing research on it. Props to you guys. Good luck with your research. Yeah, so I have some questions that some of the members of the audience submitted when they registered. If anyone else like has a question that they're dying to ask, like feel free to raise your hand and I'll get to you next. But so this question is from Julia. What was it like dealing with local leaders like the mayor, the activists, etc., for the study, and how in particular did you want them to contribute, and was getting them to contribute difficult?
So no, getting them to contribute was not difficult. Like Ella said earlier, it definitely was one of those things where people were really interested in telling their stories. And also important to note, we were one of maybe 5 different groups that was like doing a project on Hoosick Falls at the time. And people were generous, super generous with their time. In terms of what it was like to talk to people, I think we touched on the fact that there were definitely some internal politics in the community, you know, such as some folks who are ride or die, some folks who want to leave, and that I think we had to be very careful with not telling one person, hey, we are going to interview this other person who you've told us is like your sworn enemy, you know, in 2 weeks. But again, because we were there as kind of impartial researchers, we knew that that was kind of what we had to do.
Yeah, we had also in the beginning of framing our research, we had a discussion about the potentially exploitative nature of turning somebody's personal tragedy into an academic project, and there are a lot of like actual regulations and boxes you need to check around ethics and research. So we certainly were able to check those boxes, but that is something we were aware of and another tricky thing to navigate. But I will say that I grew up in a village. And so I think being able to navigate a familiar environment was helpful in speaking to people. Yeah, and as Maya said, there was a story that people wanted to tell. And right, we gave them that space.
Yeah, that makes sense. Next question from Jillian. I don't know if Jillian joined on and then hopped off. So I don't know if she had an internet connection thing or something, but I'll ask her question anyway. What are the US and EPA currently doing about PFOAs? Have you heard of the significant new use rule? And can you explain it? So I know you guys kind of touched on where PFOAs are at now, but can you talk about the significant new use rule if you guys are familiar with it?
I cannot right now.
I
I'm sorry.
also unfortunately cannot, but good to know.
Jillian's not here.
Something to Google this evening.
Something to
Yeah,
Google.
I mean, what I can say about the regulatory process and is just that it's a long road, and that new use rule is only going to be kind of the first step in being able to start the process of regulating and cleaning up and phasing out these chemicals. So, you know, as we were in 2017, we have a long road ahead of us.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this is our last like submitted question that I'll get to. And again, audience, you can submit questions in the chat or you can raise your hand, we'll get to you. This is from Ariana, who you guys met, who is in the audience as well. Ariana's awesome. You can say hi if you want. But yeah.
Hey.
So yeah, you guys talked to Ariana on the podcast a little bit. She is just wondering, how often does environmental justice get brought up in your respective workplaces? I'm interested to hear as well.
Do you want to go first, Ella?
Sure. So in the work that brings me my income, unfortunately never, but in the work that I am constantly doing as a community organizer and an activist, it gets brought up regularly. My community is very working class and a very fragile ecosystem. So it is a regular discussion in the groups I'm a part of. I work with student activists, high school youth climate activists. And I also am very active in my local DSA chapter, which has an eco-socialism subcommittee. Environmental justice, I don't think that was a topic I was introduced to until college potentially, but out in the world, it is something that gets discussed in my community regularly. And this spring, I ended up preparing like a single page curriculum outline about environmental justice for high school teachers so that they could talk about the intersection of systemic racism and environmental problems in America. So yeah, happy to say that it is constantly a part of the work I do.
Awesome.
And I would say, you know, I'm on the Hill. It's in all the environmental legislation you see introduced these days on, you know, the Dem side. People are not introducing environmental bills without having a component on justice these days. And I think that is new. That is something that, you know, I've been on the Hill for a little over 3 years now. And I'm more involved in policy now than I used to be, but I don't think we were even seeing that so pervasively even 3 years ago. And now it's part of the conversation. It's central actually to the conversation, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that is encouraging to hear, because it is, I mean, I didn't learn about it till college either. I don't think it's really something it's being taught, but very newly and in upper levels. So that's good to hear that it's making its way to the Hill and high schoolers.
I definitely would like to just note kind of the change in public consciousness that we've had over the past couple years for an innumerable amount of reasons. But I think culturally people are becoming aware that the problems we have are systemic and that the problems we have are intersectional. Those are words that weren't part of the common vernacular 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and now they very much are. So I think finally we are able to connect these dots.
And we really, I think obviously have to pay tribute to the people who were kind of fighting for it to become part of the common vernacular. The climate activists, the environmental activists that came before, because obviously this is all happening now because of them.
Yeah, we've come a long way and we have a long way to go. We'll go with that. So audience members, any questions you have for Ella and Maya, our awesome panelists today? You can raise your hand, you can just randomly unmute, or, oh, thank you, Stephen. You're awesome, thank you for being here, and happy Earth Day to you as well, if you have to hop off. Thank you. Yeah, any like final questions from our audience you want to ask Ella and Maya? This is the time.
Yeah, you can. Oh wait. Oh, you sent that privately. Ellie and Jacob. Yes, I will. You guys can. I'll privately send you guys my email.
Awesome. Yay, networking. Okay, I guess we will wrap it up then. Ella and Maya, you guys were amazing. Thank you for taking the time out of your obviously very busy and awesome schedules to talk to our little WIC crew here. Really appreciate it. Very inspired, and hopefully Hoosick Falls, gets some progress going on from here. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone who attended today. We'll send that book that Ella previewed, and then some other stuff on Hoosick Falls for people that are dying to do some more research after hearing this amazing conversation with Ella and Maya. Any closing words, Ella and Maya, before we go?
Thank you, Annabelle, for putting this event on. This is an amazing group, and we're really excited to be here and appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, it is wonderful to be presenting for an organization run by students. It is fantastic to see students in the audience. And right, there is so much information available from so many different organizations, whether it's about PFOA or it's about the sociological impacts of crises on these communities, or it's just kind of about the American mindset around crisis and contamination. So keep learning, keep doing the work, and we appreciate everybody being here.
Awesome.
Today.
We have come a long way, and we've got a long way to go. We'll leave it at that, I guess. Thanks again, Ella and Maya. Thank you all in the audience for being here. Awesome to have you guys, and happy Earth Day. Have an awesome rest of your Earth Day.
Hey, everyone. Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone. Bye.